Now it's my pleasure to introduce and to describe his experiences of digital campaigning here in the United Kingdom. Please, Dr. Mark Pack.
Thank you. I don't know, are my slides being sorted as well, or? I will proceed without slides. It's a proper way of presenting. I thought, as you've heard both from Jen and from Vincent about presidential elections, and the last campaign I worked on was a rather less glamorous council by-election, rather than competing directly head-to-head with the glamour of lessons from presidential elections, I would take a slightly different take, and because I think there's a fundamental question that rarely gets asked, but is massively useful in understanding why some technologies get adapted and used enthusiastically by political campaigns and why some don't. And it's simply the problem of scale. And I'll give you an example. A typical British parliamentary constituency has around 80,000 electors in it. Now imagine your candidate or MP, and let's be relatively unambitious. Let's imagine you want to speak to each of your voters only for a couple of minutes. You know, a couple of minutes is enough to tell them something, enough to get a bit of an idea about what they're concerned about. So we're setting the bar quite low, 2 minutes conversation. And again, because we're setting the bar quite low, let's say you only want to speak to them once a year. However, when you think about that, 80,000 people, 2 minutes, once a year, what that means is you have to spend just under 7.5 hours a day, every day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks of the year, no day off for Christmas, in order to be able to get round everyone once. And that, in a way, is the fundamental communications problem that politicians and campaign organisers and so on have. It's that essentially there are too many voters and there's not enough time. And the technologies that really take off, and I think make a difference to the way political campaigns operate, are the ones that help crack that problem. Now, over the decades, over the centuries even, there's been a whole load of different ways of trying to crack that problem of scale. The most brutally effective, but I doubt anyone is really going to be that keen on copying it, but the most brutally effective way, if you sort of look over the sweep of history, is the ancient Greeks, because nominally they had a very intensive one-to-one style of politics where, you know, individual citizens came and debated directly, a sort of form of direct democracy, people debating issues directly with each other. But the way they managed that was by having huge numbers of slaves who weren't allowed to vote, not allowing any foreigners to vote and take part in the electoral system, and of course, because we're talking about something in the past, just not allowing women either to take part in the electoral system. So if you have huge numbers of slaves, if you exclude foreigners, if you exclude half the population, you can get to a small enough number for that human level to be able to deal one-to-one with people. But obviously, once you get into a more recognisable form of democracy, that problem of scale hits. And it's no coincidence, I think, that if you look back over, say, previous periods of huge technical innovation in what communication methods political campaigns use, that it's been the scale that's driven that. So what made radio and TV become extremely popular with political campaigns in the early 20th century? It wasn't really that politicians had been sitting around before thinking, you know, oh, it would be really nice if instead of, you know, using the printed flyers that were previously very common, if people could hear my voice rather than see the words. It was because radio provided a very effective way of one person speaking and literally millions of people being able to listen. And TV similarly provided that mass communications option. And that problem of scale is one that is getting, in a way, is getting worse, partly because populations continue to grow, even in countries like Britain with relatively slow population growth compared to other countries. But that issue about, you know, how many votes do you need to win continues to, sort of the number continues to grow, to creep up. And also a problem, I think, because one of the possible solutions to that problem of scale is just completely off the political agenda. Because one way of saying, well, 80,000 people, one person, how do you possibly do it, is to say, well, let's have more politicians. And certainly the number of politicians per head of population varies hugely between countries. I mean, people involved in local government in Britain often look on quite enviously to the number of local politicians and indeed the levels of power that they have in France, for example. So I think different countries are at different places with this problem scale, but what is really not on the political agenda in any country is people saying what we want to introduce are hundreds more politicians. So we've got growing population, number of politicians not going up, that problem of scale getting more and more pressing. And it's why I think if you look at some of the first uses of digital technology and online campaigning back in the 1990s and then into this century, why some technologies didn't really take off. Instant messaging is a good example, back from the early days of AOL and MSN, AOL Instant Messenger and so on, through to then things like BlackBerry Messenger and now most recently things like WhatsApp. If you look at it from a technical rather than a political perspective, instant messaging in its various forms has been hugely successful. There have been very big companies, very large user bases. You may have seen in the news earlier this week that WhatsApp is now saying it has a larger regular user base than Twitter. So massively successful technology, almost not at all taken up in political campaigning, because the problem with instant messaging is it doesn't let you do that one-to-many communication in a terribly efficient or effective way. It's really good at one-to-one communication amongst a small group of people, but when it's one person trying to reach your 80,000, or indeed on a national scale, one person trying to reach people in the millions, it doesn't work, it doesn't scale, and hence, for all the success of instant messaging in all sorts of other fields, very little take-up in the political sphere. So I think that's one of the key questions that's always worth thinking about. Why is, when new technologies come along, and there's always somebody keenly saying this thing is going to revolutionise politics, going to revolutionise campaigning, is asking that question, does it scale? The second question, the related question, obviously, is who are you talking to? I mean, obviously, talking to the right volume of people to be able to influence an election result is important, but also talking to the right people, having the right things to say to them matters as well. And I think, in a way, if you can almost take myself and where I live and my neighbours as quite a good example of what we have seen evolved over particularly the last 15 or 20 years. I live in a ward that has local council level, one Labour councillor and two Liberal Democrat councillors. So it's a split Labour Liberal Democrat ward. You can sort of think of it as sort of swing Labour Lib Dem territory even in that respect. And in a way that's how political campaigns would have thought of it 20 years ago. They would have fairly crudely politically characterised that whole area as it's a Labour Lib Dem swing territory. And particularly actually some very impressive stuff that the Democrats were doing, way back in the 1980s about coming up with statistical scoring methods for scoring the equivalent of what we in Britain would call each polling district in terms of is it a strong Democrat area, a strong Republican area, a swing area, and so on. But obviously that notion of it being a swing area doesn't really get you to the individual voters, and are you sending the right message to the right people? Because although it is, in that sense, a Labour Lib Dem swing ward, between Labour and the Lib Dems, the two parties get maybe 80% of the vote, and in the local election turnout, that's 80% of the vote on a 40% turnout. So there's a huge number of other people who are either voting for other parties or not voting that crude categorisation tactic doesn't get to. And then what we've seen more recently, I guess, in the last 10 years or so, is the use of large sort of consumer data sets. Things like Mosaic and Experian databases in the UK, which take in lots of different data, some of it public, some of it in terms of what we've bought from supermarkets and all that sort of stuff, to try to categorise things. And in Britain, typically, those sorts of classification schemes classify people down to the level of sort of clumps of 10 or 20 houses. And that, in some way, is very sophisticated and very successful. But again, if you take me and my three immediate neighbours, across those four households, 3 out of the 4 households have young children. 3 out of the 4 of us are parents with young children. 3 out of 4 of us are in private property. So 3 out of 4 households with kids, 1 household without kids. 3 out of 4 households are private accommodation, one household is a council flat. So you can characterise overall the area as being somewhere that it's parents with young kids living in private accommodation. And that's different from just round the corner where there is a council estate. So and that sort of mosaic type classification, different forms that I think all parties really use quite a lot now, is obviously better than simply crudely categorising both that clump of properties and the council estate next door as just all being Labour Lib Dem swing areas. But the problem is, if you go up to each of our 4 doors thinking behind this door there is a parent with young kids living in private accommodation, you'll actually be wrong in 2 out of the 4 doors that you knock on, because one of the doors is actually the council flat and one of the doors is there are no kids behind that door. So it's still a fairly sort of crude way of classifying people. And I think, and this is where particularly I think for a lot of people in Britain, a lot of the work done by the Obama campaign especially is most interesting. You can see the next sort of step that campaigns are trying to get to is that level of being able to think of me not as about the geography of the overall area that I live in, not about the similarities between me and my immediate neighbours, but to be able to think about you specifically, Mark Pack, you live in a private accommodation, you don't have any kids and you like chocolate, so we know what messages to best target to you. And the way that is developing, I think, is a good example of how it's often can be a little misleading to take the online world and look at it completely in isolation. Because part of what we've seen political campaigns in other countries and increasingly in Britain do is to turn to the online world to say, well, okay, there is this voter, what can we find about what you've said on Facebook? What can you find about what you've tweeted? To try to identify your individual characteristics to get that refinement down. Partly it's about the use of these big computer data sets, consumer data sets, which are really driven by the ability of computers to pull in large amounts of data and analyse them quite intensively. The fact that the computers are online and networked and can share data and so on in a way is quite useful, but the thing that has really driven those computer data sets is the processing power. It's the people who have been inventing faster and better chips rather than particularly the people who have been doing clever stuff to network them together. And then thirdly, linked to this, as I think you know, was a very important point about the François Hollande campaign, is the use of volunteers to go door knocking, to get beyond even what you can get from what I say about myself online and even what you can work out from me from what I buy from a supermarket. And it's the combination of those 3 different trends that provide a different and better way for election campaigns to meet that challenge of scale. And those of you who are familiar with sort of British cult TV from the past, you know, may well be familiar with a TV series called The Prisoner, where Patrick McGoohan always used to there used to be a voiceover at the start where Patrick McGoohan was saying, I'm not a number, I am a free man, and there's sort of, you know, that sense of, you know, you can't just categorise me. And I think what political parties have sort of had to do in terms of that challenge of scale, as we've had mass democracy and women being allowed to have the vote and so on, is actually forced into treating voters as numbers, because if you want to deal with people on such a scale, you can't think of each of them as an individual. What I find, however, quite optimistic and promising, though, is a lot of these developments about, and although admittedly there's a slightly double-edged nature to the extent of data that we reveal about ourselves online, but one of the positive aspects about the amount of data that we reveal online, the amount of data that we reveal about ourselves through our purchasing habits and so on, is that increasingly it allows the people who are dealing with the numbers at scale to actually respect much more the individual characteristics and variations amongst different voters, rather than simply crudely lumping everyone together who lives in a particular part of North London as they must all be the same, and instead bring out the individuality of ourselves through more and clever and more sophisticated use of numbers and targeting. So in a way, to answer the question posed by the title of this session, I think people do matter very much in political campaigns, but crucially they matter when you get the numbers right, so you can deal with them on the necessary scale to be able to win an election. Thanks.